Hi, everybody. This is Pastor John from Third Presbyterian Church, and this is now week 14 of the study of amazing women, amazing wisdom, amazing women. Today, we're going to look at the second part of that sister couple, Martha of Bethany. If you remember last week, we looked at Mary of Bethany. This week, we're going to look at her sister, Martha. Now, we had this map on display last week because I wanted to show you that Bethany was just a small distance from Jerusalem. The temple was built up on the top of a hill where most of Jerusalem lied. So you would come down the hill through the Garden of Gethsemane and then weave your way down a road through the Mount of Olives to the place known as Bethany. And that's where Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus lived. We know from Scripture that they were all close friends of Jesus. We're not really sure how that friendship developed. Just suffice it to say that they were close friends. We identify Martha, though, as a talker. And there are key verses in Scripture where she talks, particularly to Jesus. And it's important what she says, what Jesus' response is, and what her actions are concerning Jesus' conversation. The first scripture we're going to take a look at is from Luke 10:38 through 42, and it's in the New International Version. This is a scripture that we looked at last week with respect to Mary. We focused on Mary in the scripture. Now we're going to focus on Martha. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." So let's unpack this reading a little bit, now from the perspective of Martha. And we want to look first of all at Martha's actions. It says that Martha opened up her house to Jesus. It's pretty apparent from that phrase in the text that Martha was the one in charge. We don't know if she shared ownership in the house with her other siblings or if the house was hers, but she was the one who could grant people the right to come into her house or not come into her house. And then we see that when Jesus comes into her house, Martha instantly follows the prescribed role of what someone who invited a traveler into their house should be. And in fact, she is so engaged in all of these different tasks that have been dictated to her by society that she gets distracted with spending any time with Jesus because she's busy with all this preparation. So again, when travelers would stop by someone's home in the days of Jesus, it was really a big deal. It wasn't like you just have a relative that drops in unexpectedly and you maybe offer them something to drink and maybe a snack if you have something. This was a situation where if someone came to your house and you welcomed them in, you literally had to welcome them in, which meant that you would pay them attention, you would prepare a meal for them, you would take care of all of their traveling needs, and as we saw last week with Mary, you would even go to the extent of washing that person's feet. So Martha is following this protocol. She knows exactly what a good Jewish woman in the days of Jesus should do when she offers her house to a traveler, and in this case, Jesus. And she's distracted by all of this. She wants to do a good job. She doesn't want word to get around that she invited a traveler in and she didn't treat him very well. So let's look at her words that she says in this text. She complains that she has been left to do all this preparation. So the cooking of the food, the preparing of the table, all the other things that were needed, she's been left to do this by herself. And she confronts Jesus, whom she understands to be a person of fairness and equality. And she asks him the question, don't you care? So she's presenting to Jesus that she's stuck doing all the work. Mary's not helping out. That's not fair. So Jesus, I'm pointing this out to you. Don't you care? And then from her words, Jesus indicates that she's worried about many things. She must be a detailed-oriented person. He's telling her, yes, I know you have a lot on your mind. You're worried about this, that, and the other. That's your personality. But then Jesus goes on and pushes it a little further in an answer that some people struggle with. Many people have asked the same question in a situation of fairness. Many are disappointed by the answer that Jesus gives to Martha. But let's take a look at what Jesus did not say. First of all, he didn't tell Martha to be silent. She has no business asking a question, which according to tradition and protocol, he had every right to do. Even though it was her house and she invited him in, she was a woman and she was not entitled by any right or any protocol to ask any questions. So Jesus doesn't say, Martha, excuse me, but you're a woman and I don't really have to listen to your question. Then he didn't tell Martha that he didn't have time to settle family disputes. So oftentimes in other texts in the New Testament, Jesus is called upon to settle a dispute between family members. And that was not really Jesus's role as the Messiah or as a rabbi or a great teacher. So he doesn't say, you know what, Martha, you and Mary have a problem. The two of you need to work it out and then get back to me. And he doesn't throw the I'm a gifted scholar card, and no one, not even a woman, or especially a woman, has the right to ask me any questions. So because he was recognized as a rabbi, as a teacher of the law, then it was very difficult to ask him any questions, whether you were a male or a female, and absolutely forbidden if you were a female. Jesus does, in his response, really take her seriously. The issue is he just doesn't agree with her logic, and he attempts to point that out and point out something about her personality. So I mentioned before that Martha was very detail-oriented, and she's given much to following proper protocol and tradition. So let's take apart Jesus' answer to her in a little bit more detail. So Jesus begins by saying, Martha, Martha. The use of that double naming in the culture of Jesus meant you better pay attention to what I have to say. I'm saying your name twice. In fact, there are only two other times in the New Testament where Jesus uses that double word intro. He mentions it when he says, Simon, Simon, when he's confronting Peter and assures him he does not agree with him, but will pray for him. And Saul, Saul, when he confronts Paul on the road to Damascus to challenge him to change his ways. This was a common way of getting someone's attention. I can share in my own experience, if my dad called me John because he wanted to talk to me, well, I understood that I better listen. But if he called me John Robert, I had really better pay attention. Well, this is calling Martha the same as John Robert. He's wanting Martha to really listen to what he has to say. Then Jesus goes on to say, yeah, I understand your frustration. He acknowledges she's worried and upset about many things. But then he suggests that she take a step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. As we would say, stop sweating the small stuff. Putting this in perspective, in the days of Jesus, if a traveler entered a home, as I've already talked about, there was a detailed protocol of what to do and what not to do. And you had to follow this protocol. Otherwise, word would get around that people should not patronize your house. Jesus is suggesting that that protocol doesn't matter to him. What matters to him is the bigger picture. And I think there's a theology there that's important for us. Sometimes we get all wound up about the small things, and we lose sight of what the big picture is. So this is we have a Martha moment. And so I think this scripture helps us understand that Jesus knows that the small things will get to us. But let's not sweat those. Let's not lose sight of the overall picture. Many biblical scholars believe his response to Martha is the same advice he gives to all of us. When so oftentimes we say, Lord, I can't do that because I don't have any time or energy, or I don't have any reason to give commitment to my faith right now or my church. So oftentimes when we're asked in the church to volunteer to do something, aren't we oftentimes concerned with all the small things that are going on in our life? And we come up with this laundry list of reasons why we can't because we're so involved in all of this small stuff. Maybe this is a story about Jesus saying, don't sweat that small stuff. Listen to what I've asked you to do in service in your faith journey or in service to your church. Now, the next story that we take a look at after this story is the story of raising Lazarus from the dead. And many biblical archaeologists have identified this tomb in Bethany as the most likely place where Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, was buried after his death. And this was, we'll look at in a moment, another time when Martha speaks and acts before the presence of Jesus. Now, just so we have an understanding of how all of this worked back in those days, when a body died, it was anointed, covered in grave clothes, put into a tomb where it would be, the door would be sealed shut, and it would be removed 6 to 9 months later. And then the bones that were left would be put into an ossuary. Now, why was that? Because one of the beliefs in those days was that when you died, your soul, your spirit went to kind of a holding place. Your body needed to decay back to the bones because when God came for the final judgment, God would take those bones, recreate a new body for you, and infuse that soul that was in the holding pattern back into that. There would be a new heaven and a new earth. And so that was what they were doing. Lazarus had died. We don't know what caused his death, but they had put him in this tomb, and they were beginning the process of decomposition with the idea that 6 to 9 months later, they would remove his body from this tomb. So let's take a look at John 11, 21 through 27 out of the New International Version. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, no, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. Let's unpack this scripture between Martha and Jesus. Theologians call this a confessional statement on the part of Martha. Why do they call it that? Well, it begins with a complaint from Martha's emotions. She's convinced that because of what she has seen and heard about Jesus, that Jesus has the power to heal. And if Jesus had arrived at their home when Lazarus was still sick, he could have easily employed his healing powers so that Lazarus would not have died. So it's confessional in that she's basing her complaint on the fact that she believes Jesus has the power to heal. And she even extends that supernatural power to that moment, because she said, I know he's dead, but I know you have some sort of power over all of that. Then when Jesus points out the resurrection, she's again confessional because she echoes the Hebrew teaching from what's called the dry bones story. And again, this is why they kept bones in an ossuary, because there's an Old Testament story called the dry bones story. The dry bones story points out that in the final day of judgment, when God returns back to the earth, God will then take those bones, sew them back together with flesh and tissue and organs, and make a new human being, and then they will infuse that into the soul, into that person. Now, not all the Hebrew people believed in that, but certainly the Mary and Martha and Lazarus were of a particular religious sect that believed that, because she points out, yeah, I know about the Jewish tradition of resurrection. I don't want to wait for that final judgment day. I want him alive now. But then Jesus confronts her with a new version of resurrection, one only made available at the coming of the Messiah. And Jesus asks her if she believes that he's the Messiah, and Martha confesses she believes Jesus to be that Messiah. So that's why it's called a confessional statement. She believes that Jesus has power to heal. She believes that Jesus can even make power take place now. And Martha believes that Jesus is the Messiah, and that Jesus points out that resurrection is really all about the power of Jesus and not necessarily something that's going to happen at the very end. This is a very important and critical moment in Scripture because it changed the dynamics for the Hebrew people, and it really changes the dynamics for us. Now, I've never been a big fan of these biblical drawings, but this is one that I found. I'm okay with it because it kind of shows what happens. But when we read the next part of the scripture, Jesus instructs them to roll the stone away. But of course, there's some hesitation from guess who? From Martha. And she says, wait a minute, he's been in there for a while. Decomposition is taking place, and surely he must stinketh. That's how it's written in the old King James Version. So Martha has this faith, but even then she slips into being a little bit practical about the situation. However, they roll the stone away. Jesus commands him to come out, and he comes out. Now, the importance of this story, which really comes about only because of Martha's questioning, is that resurrection is not on a linear basis as what happens after death. Let me explain. In the Hebrew culture that believed in the resurrection, you lived, you died, your body went back to the dust from which it was created, your bones were preserved, your soul went to a holding place, it was called Sheol, and then whenever, could be a month later or years or centuries later, whenever God came to earth for the final judgment, then your body would be resurrected from the bones, recreated, your soul would be infused, and that was resurrection. Jesus, that's a linear approach to resurrection. Jesus says it's not linear. Once you accept Jesus, you are resurrected. You begin that resurrected life. Now, your life may come to a physical end, but it does not come to a spiritual end. And that all goes back to the meeting with Nicodemus back in John 3, where Jesus tries to explain that the flesh is flesh, but the spirit is spirit. And so this is a very important shift in the idea of death and resurrection. And that's really an idea that we carry with us in the Christian church today. We trust the passage in John where Jesus talks about a mansion in heaven where rooms are being prepared for us, and that upon our physical death, spiritually, we go to that room that has been created for us. We don't have to wait until the great judgment day. So it's not really a linear explanation anymore. So what Jesus does by raising Lazarus from the dead is he dispels both theories. One group of Jewish religious folks felt that there was no resurrection, and the others felt that there was resurrection, but it was only down the road hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. In this one act of raising Lazarus from the dead, brought about because of Martha's insistence, Jesus dispels all of those. And when Jesus asks her if she believes he's the Messiah, when she says, I do, that instant begins the resurrection in her life, as it does for each one of us. Now it tells us in John 11:41a and 42 that the whole village was there to watch this. And in that watching, Jesus pauses for a moment to say a prayer to God. Let's read. So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. So Jesus is saying, this is my example to everyone, that I have the power over resurrection. The scene at the cross later on, where Jesus is on that cross, is talked about with some women present. Certainly one of the women that's identified is Mary, his mother. And scholars have often wondered if Mary and Martha were there at the cross as well. And knowing what they had experienced firsthand with their brother's body coming out of the grave, that really when Jesus died on that cross and was put in the grave, because he truly was the Messiah, the God in person, that grave would not be able to hold him. So let's take a look at the wisdom of Martha. Martha was very practical. She felt it dutiful to the customs and traditions of her time, but she was also very outspoken. So Jesus encourages her not to sweat the small stuff. Perhaps she changed a little, but then she mentions about Lazarus might be smelling, so perhaps not so much. And really, is she kind of like us? God's always telling us not to sweat the small stuff, and we say, okay, I'll work on it. And then we do that until the next thing happens and we start sweating the small stuff again. Obviously, she had a deep love for Jesus, and she trusts that he is the one whom God sent. Her bold comments at the tomb set the stage for one of Jesus' most well-known public display of his power over death. And in all of this, Martha never loses faith in Jesus, even in the most difficult of times, even with the death of her brother, whom at first she said, Jesus, if you would have been here, this wouldn't have happened. But that doesn't diminish her faith that Jesus can't do something even after the death process has begun. Now, as we're finished with our look at Mary and Martha, I always like to do some comparative questions. Number one, do you identify yourself more with Mary, who was led by her emotions and really not concerned about the present reality or much detail? Or are you a Martha, having faith but concerned about the details and not willing to let things go? Maybe you're a little bit of both. What do you think? Number two, the scripture suggests that both Mary and Martha were not married, and yet they were close friends of Jesus. It appears in the scriptures that Jesus has close friendships with both men and women. It appears by many that he values friendship to be more important than marriage. So how are you able to handle close friendships, particularly when it's someone of the opposite sex, of which you're not into a marriage covenant? Have you heard the term, oh, that's my work husband or my work wife? Well, what do you think about that term and that expression in our society today? And finally, number three, our denomination respects the gifts of all people, whether they're women or men. We ordain officers at all levels by both males and females. And one argument over the history has been how Jesus included women in important biblical points of reference in a society that really treated women as second-class citizens. And that's why Presbyterians believe that the gifts of women are extremely important to the church, equally important as the gifts of men. Jesus did that with women and with men. He looked at their gifts and he incorporated them in the ministry and mission, depending upon their gifts, not whether they were a male or a female. Unfortunately, some denominations today still shy away from giving women any preaching leadership. What do you think about that? What do you think Mary and Martha would think about that? Well, we only have three more women to look at. Next week, we're going to look at Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then after that, we'll look at Mary Magdalene. So I thank you so much for giving your time to these Bible studies, and I hope they've been an important lesson, and I hope you've learned some new things from this. And have a blessed week, and I will see you next week.